What is it that makes a small, noisy, drafty car one of the most desirable true sports cars? A car which makes men out of boys and little boys out of grown men. A car which has remained largely unchanged in outward appearance since it was first introduced to an eager public in 1957. This is the story of that car. It's a measure of the respect and admiration which the owners have for their cars that it's still known by its original name, even though it was changed in the early 70s. The car is, of course, the Super 7. This is not so much a history of the development of the 7 as a pictorial celebration of a landmark in British sports car design. The story of the 7 starts back in 1953, when Colin Chapman, a 25-year-old engineer working at the time for the British Aluminium Company, opened up a part-time business at No. 7 Tottenham Lane, North London, making small cars for racing in trials. He called his company the Lotus Engineering Company Limited, and he capitalized on his reputation and success in producing club racing cars. However, the market was essentially limited in scope, so as his ambition was to get into the manufacture of proper racing cars, Chapman set about designing a kit car which would provide him with the capital to realize his ambitions. The kit car wasn't a new concept, but Chapman wanted to develop it into an art form of its own. His first design was called the Lotus Mark VI. It was sold in component form to customers who could build it themselves, with Lotus assistance if necessary, in about 20 hours. The overall cost, assuming you bought all the body and engine parts, was about £425. The Mark VI was an instant success, but still Chapman wasn't fully satisfied. He modified it constantly and was soon producing other versions, which he called the Mark VIII, Mark IX and the Mark XI. The Mark X was just a larger engine Mark VIII. But even at this stage, he had privately reserved the Mark VII for something special. This was to be at the forefront of the dramatic changes which he had planned for Lotus engineering. In 1957, Chapman launched his revitalized Lotus Engineering Company as a bona fide manufacturer. He produced two cars, the Lotus Elite, an upmarket plastic-bodied grand touring car, fully built and ready to drive, and the Lotus 7. To quote his own words, "The 7 was a car I dreamed about as a schoolboy. When I got the chance to build it, it was the most basic, lightest, high-performance little car we could come up with. A student's car, if you will, a four-wheeled motorbike." And so it was. Because it was sold in kit form, it didn't attract purchase tax, and this meant that the price would fall within the pockets of a wide and wholly enthusiastic market. Although it was primarily designed for the milder forms of competition motoring, it nevertheless conformed to the requirements of an on-road car as well. So owners could drive to a meeting in the car, race it, and then drive home again at the end of an exhilarating day. But it still was a basic car. Such luxuries as a heater, windscreen wipers, or even a hood or tonneau cover were optional extras. And as for side screens, well, there weren't any. And neither was there a petrol gauge. These things only came later. The 7 was introduced to the public at the 1957 Motor Show in London and attracted immediate attention. Its price was £587 the lot. Such was the success that the small Lotus works soon became overcrowded. Chapman needed to move to larger and better equipped premises, and in October 1959 he got his wish. Through the efforts of his good friend Peter Curwen-Taylor, he moved into his new factory at Cheshunt, 14 miles north of London. He also took the opportunity to reorganize the company. He created a parent, which he called Lotus Cars Limited, and set up subsidiaries of Lotus Components, Lotus Developments, and Team Lotus. Even now, though, the 7 was only built as a time filler between his racing activities, and almost all the cars sold were in kit form. But realizing that this was not the way to get into the real car market, Chapman began to set up dealerships in 1959. One of the first dealers to be signed up was a small company called Caterham Car Sales in Surrey. This company, and particularly its owner, Graham Nairn, was to play perhaps the most crucial role in the future of the Seven.
At that particular point, Lotus cars, under their founder Colin Chapman, were actually expanding and beginning to appoint dealers, and so we became one of the first dealers ever appointed. They were called Lotus centres in those days, and of the original bunch that were first appointed by Colin Chapman, we're the sole remaining one. The others are either bankrupt or in jail or long since disappeared. The whole of the sales were kit cars. The basis of it in those days was that there was purchase tax only applicable to fully produced objects, so there was purchase tax on a motor car, but if there were spare parts, then there was no purchase tax. And so Colin Chapman very cleverly exploited this idea of, if you didn't buy a motor car from him, you bought two sets of parts from two different companies, and you actually had to finish to complete the car. It took a while for it to sink in. First of all, on price, you could buy an ordinary sports car like an Austin Healey Sprite, for example, for about the same money. But if you wanted to go motor racing, then it was a different story altogether, because here was a car that you would use on the road. You could actually drive it to the circuit and be very competitive without having to spend a lot of money on modifications. So it was very well received by these sporting enthusiasts, and took a little while to sink in, I think, with the general public.
Prices at this time ranged from £587 for a 7 with a Ford engine to just over £700 for the more powerful Coventry Climax version. Remarkably cheap by any standards. Almost immediately the 7 was launched, buyers began to enter it for all sorts of meetings. Club racing, hill climbs, trials, you name it, they did it. And by 1959, owners had notched up wins at virtually all the English club circuits, and the 7F eclipsed the 1172 Formula class, whilst the 7C was the undisputed king of the sprints.
Not telling you the truth. Don't believe it. Don't believe it.
In June 1960, the Series 2-7 was introduced. This was to be different from the Series 1 in that it was to be a road car first, but at home on the track, whereas the Series 1 was the other way round. Predictably, it was a success, and it gained even more fame and recognition when it was included in the television series The Prisoner. Patrick McGowan, the star of the series, each week leapt into the car and sped off to adventures new, watched by several million viewers. The car represented the rebel in people, the break from convention, the means to throw aside the constraints of society and find yourself. And it worked. The Prisoner spawned a cult following which persists to this day, in just the same way as the 7 did.
If you remember the series, Patrick McGowan wanted to portray himself very much as an individual. You know, I'm not a number, I'm a free man. And I think he recognised that Lotus produced those sort of cars, and so he went up to the Lotus factory, and they were trying very hard to sell him the idea of having a Lotus Elan. But there was the old Lotus demonstrator, I suspect under a tarpaulin, which or tarpaulin may have blown off, I don't know, but there was the demonstrator KAR 120C, and so of course McGowan just looked at that and said, "I want that car," you know, in that sort of clipped voice in which he spoke, and he would accept no other. It just, as far as he was concerned, it personified the whole series, if you like. It was an individual car. He built it himself. He was a free man. It was perfect for the series. Yes, I was in it for all of about 20 seconds, I think. We spent the whole day was spent filming, where the film extra was doing his best to drive the car through the cameras. So in the end, McGowan asked me if I'd drive the car for him, which of course I readily agreed. And he actually said, "Well, you know, what do you want in the way of payment?" So I said, "Well, I'll have a few photographs." And then right at the very end, when he was sort of almost running out of money and so on, in the middle of Trafalgar Square, he got all the spotlights on and said, "Hey, I've got to do those photographs with you."
But success brought near disaster in its wake. The Lotus Elite, which was Chapman's real car, as opposed to the 7 fun car, had drained the resources of Lotus cars.
I think when you refer to Lotus crisis, that's fair comment, but of course it wasn't necessarily their own making. I think Lotus cars merely followed the fortunes of the British economy, depending which Chancellor Exchequer had been to which evening class to read about economics. That was how it all went up and down. Of course, Lotus were victim to those fluctuations in the economy. Certainly in 1968, they had just moved to the new factory up in Hethel. They'd only been there barely a couple of years, and they were moving forward with a new range of cars. That's the Lotus Elan, Lotus Europa, and so on. And so they decided really that the 7 wasn't for them, and they needed to move forward from that. And I met with Chapman at one of the racing car shows, and I persuaded him to keep it going, and he was quite happy to do that on the basis that at least it paid the overheads for these. It was called Lotus Components in those days. They actually manufactured the 7, and that also used to produce all the racing cars apart from Formula 1, and so it enabled him to keep the racing mechanics busy in the off-racing season and so on. And so it was quite a sort of friendly arrangement to start with, where he built them when he felt like it, and we always undertook to buy them and sell them on. But subsequently, of course, it developed from that. We managed to market it and push it forward, and so the sales increased, and that led to the Series 3 and so on.
In 1966, a new factory was occupied by Lotus cars at Hethel, near Norwich, and the 7 naturally went with it. The car performed consistently well on the track. One sports writer was moved to write, "On rough surface corners, it's necessary to let the car drive itself. It'll jump around and make a fuss, even hop over and change its line by 3 or 4 feet. If left alone, however, it'll wind up headed in the right direction and still going like blazes." And this is acceleration for which you normally have to pay telephone numbers. In practice, it means that lines of slow-moving traffic cease to exist. So far, we've talked about the history and development of the 7. The Series 2 was superseded by the Series 3-7 in 1968, and then by the Series 3 Super 7. But the car's days were numbered. An attempt was made to radically alter the image of the 7 with the introduction of the Series 4. Road holding and performance were maintained, but the body shape was modernized and molded in fiberglass. It was meant to compete in the dune buggy market, and although it sold well, it never really captured the heart of the true enthusiast. By 1973, after the failure of Lotus Components had left Chapman in difficulties again, the 7 production line finally ground to a halt. It was the end of the line, the end of an era, a time to finally lay the mark to rest. And this would have happened had it not been for Graham Nern of Caterham Car Sales and a 7 owner named David Wakefield. They persuaded Chapman to let them continue to produce the 7, and after much negotiation, Chapman finally agreed. Everything, lock, stock and barrel, was handed over in a small ceremony in a pub in London. Lock, stock and barrel, that is, except for the name. The cars could still be produced, but they couldn't be called a Lotus.
I always felt it was a fairly logical progression for us. The problem always was to persuade Lotus that that was the way to go. I think the persuasive factors, so far as Lotus were concerned, were One, they knew that we'd done a very good job with the 7 anyway, so they didn't have to have any qualms about what deal or how the deal would work out. Secondly, it meant that they were moving yet another step forward. They were dropping the Elan and the Europa, and they were coming out with the Esprit and the Elite and the Eclat and so on. And so they felt that they really wanted to forget the old image as it was known. So they could, if anyone rang up and said, you know, I want a Lotus 7 spare or whatever it was, they could say, right, refer it to Caterham, and that dropped that. But the actual clincher, as it were, in the whole thing was that, yet again, not necessarily of Colin Chapman's making, but again the economy moving down, they closed down they closed Lotus components completely, and they were left with 45 odd Formula Ford racing cars in various states of disrepair. They were stacked up in an aircraft hangar, as I recall, up on end. They were sort of known as the row of daffodils, all these beautiful coloured cars all up on end with bird droppings and brake fluid running out all over the place. So the deal was that I bought all these Formula Fords and took all the stock of the Lotus 7s, and then that was the whole package, as it were. Even if we hadn't been able to produce any cars, I would have got the investment back in the end purely by keeping the 7 going and supplying the parts and so on. But at the back of my mind, of course, I had the fact that we wanted to keep the car in production. In England, we tend to forget exactly what Lotus is. I mean, Lotus are the same as Ferrari, if you like. There's no way he's just going to sell his name or his badge without a considerable sum of money. But he did nevertheless allow me to use the Lotus symbol with regard to Lotus 7 spares. So although we don't use the Lotus badge on the Lotus car, because after all Lotus don't make it anymore, we do, we use the Lotus badge for Lotus 7 as official Lotus 7 spare stockist.
So Nairn and Wakefield formed a company called 7 Cars Limited and set about the continued production of their favourite car. They called it the Caterham 7. And the rest is history. From that day to this, the car has been produced. Exports of the Caterham 7 have increased yearly. Indeed, in Japan, the car is one of the most sought after, commanding very high prices. Not bad for a country renowned for its own car production.
And the first thing we had to tackle when we bought the car was the fact that there was what is called national type approval had been introduced. The barrier test is probably the most well-known test of the national type approval test. That's impossible for a small company to do. It's just too expensive. You'd never amortise the costs. So we ran a sort of gentle campaign amongst members of Parliament saying that we would continue in production, but only available to overseas visitors. Englishmen would have to keep out. It wasn't possible to buy the car. And that, in a way, I think helped anyway to bring about the exemption that we now have from national type approval, providing it's sold in kit form. So everything has gone full cycle as regards that. And we've gone through this exercise throughout Europe. We've got national type approval in Germany. The German inspectors there drove the car for 3 days on the Volkswagen testing ground. We got approval in Switzerland, we got approval in Holland, and so on. And so in the marketing sense, that's what we had to do, make it possible for people to buy the car. Of course, there have been difficult times, and certainly when we took it over, it must have been one of the worst periods ever to have taken over such a project, because we immediately went into the 3-day working week. We had the oil crisis, we had the miners out on strike, we had changes of government, we had raising inflation. What else did we have? Oh, I don't know, high interest rates, just about everything. So although we didn't regret it, I would like to have picked a better moment at which to have done it. We have gone, for example, we have gone full cycle with the rear suspension. We've gone back to a Dion rear suspension, which is almost an independent rear suspension. And so that not only gives a better ride, but it also gives much better traction for the type of power that we're now getting from the top of the range engines. The external silhouette of the car and the external dimensions of the car are virtually identical, and we never change those. But within that, we always try to strive forward in engineering terms, so that the chassis is so much more stiffer now. We've had to comply with seatbelt tests, which again has involved modifications to the chassis. Certain areas we're working at all the time, but we never ever change the original concept of the car. We do basically 4 engines, all based on the 1600 Ford engine. 2 of the most popular are the middle range ones. That's the 1600 Sprint, which is 110 brake horsepower, 0 to 60 in 6.5 seconds. We do a 1700 Super Sprint, which is 135 brake horsepower, 0 to 60 in 5.9 seconds. And we then do a 1600 BDR, which is a Cosworth 16-valve twin-cam engine, and that's 150 brake horsepower, 0 to 60 in 5.5 seconds. And interestingly enough, the Cosworth used to supply engines for Lotus in the old days, so again we keep this link with the past.
In 1975, the RAC approved the Caterham 7 for racing in the mod sports class. But such were the modifications effected by some owners that as the year progressed, the rumblings of protest began to be heard from fellow competitors. First, the RAC withdrew its approval, then it reinstated it. But despite these setbacks, the car gained the class championship in 1976 and was overall third in the mod sports class. Graham Nunn tried to get the RAC to license the Super 7 for standard production class racing. But he received the reply, no way, the car is too fast to race. Naturally, with the sense of humour which 7 owners have, Nunn produced a T-shirt with the slogan, "The car that's too fast to race," emblazoned on it. They're collector's items now.
We also were banned from racing for various reasons, and so we ran a very successful campaign based on the slogan that this was the car that was too fast to race. And eventually that's come about that we now have our own class of racing. We have our own race just for purely 7s on the grid.
The story of the 7 is one of ups and downs. Any other car, if it had had to endure these trials and tribulations, would inevitably have gone under. But not the 7. It's still as popular today as it was when it was first introduced to an eager public in 1957. Proud owners never cease to extol the virtues of their own particular car.
I've owned Lotus 7s now for about 10 years. The first one I bought was a Series 4, which cost about £600, and the insurance on them is quite reasonable, provided you have a limited mileage policy.
There's not really any particular problem areas. It's quite a joke, actually. We tend to call them collector's cars because you're always collecting bits as you drive away from wherever you've just left. But you have to regularly, every day, really go around with a spanner just tightening things up. And
got married. Didn't sell the car though. A 78 Series 3, 7 which Caterham started making, again after the Series 4 which they abandoned. Drag racing pretty good, sprinting average, circuit racing not so good.
The great thing about the car is it's so positive. It responds very quickly. You put your foot down, it goes. It's more it's a bit like a rifle. You know, it just absolutely goes. You point it in the direction and it just absolutely goes. It can overtake anything. It can turn around on a threepenny bit. And it really becomes part of you. Once you're in the car, you feel like a foot inside a shoe. And you become very comfortable.
For me, when you get into the car, you don't drive the car, you feel the car. Because once you're strapped in, you feel so attuned with the whole senses of the car. And to me, it just doesn't compare with driving anything else at all. It's the nearest thing you'll come to driving a race car, I think. I must have owned about 8 or 9. When the winter comes along and it's bad, I do tend to sell them. And I start to get withdrawal symptoms and have to get one again by the next year.
Well, you become sort of two people. The first one spends about 3 or 4 hours cleaning the car and making sure it's okay. The next person jumps in it and you forget how many hours you just cleaned it. You'll go through cowpats and everything, and it's pure adrenaline. You become, I think horns come out and the devil of you comes out, and it's really very exciting. I think we tend to be a certain type of person, fairly hardy brew. And to be honest, you get the odd guy who sort of says, oh, you know, what temperature is your oil pressure at 6,500 revs, you know, the real technician. But I think a load of us really just enjoy the car and enjoy each other's company. To be honest, it becomes more of a social thing. The car is secondary and we enjoy a pint together and really swapping stories about women and holidays and all the other things that we enjoy just as well.
My wife complained that driving the car in the winter was a bit cold, so I decided to put a heater in an earlier car for her. So I bought the matrix of a heater and sort of drilled it in and wedged it above her feet. So over the winter she was quite happy with that, but there was no way of turning it off or on. So in the summer she had to drive with the knees round her face all the time.
Yeah, it's not easy to get into. You have to be careful where you put your hands, where you put your feet. Obviously, unless you're very careful, you do tend to show more than you rather would. So it's not the easiest car to get into. It's exciting to feel the wind in your hair, and everybody looks at you. It's the kind of thing that, it's an interesting car. Everybody thinks, you know, what on earth is that going past? It's very exciting to drive in.
The Seven Owners Club meets regularly to swap stories at once outrageous, apocryphal, or even vaguely truthful. Wherever it's seen, the Seven attracts wistful admiration from small boys and aging grandfathers alike, and not a little envy from those in between. All sorts of people own and drive them, from captains of industry and shop assistants to lawyers and bus drivers. The Seven transcends all perceived social barriers and classes. Indeed, Seven owners are a class on their own, an elite, a group of men and women who are dedicated to perpetuating forever the finest sports car ever built. It would be a sad day if the mark should ever die. But then, if that should ever happen, you can guarantee that, like the phoenix rising from the ashes, someone, somewhere, would get up early one day, pull the family heirloom out of the garage, start it up, and with a characteristic roar, shatter the neighborhood from its peaceful slumber. And as weary eyes looked out from behind twitching curtains, an anachronism in the shape of the Seven would speed off down the road and begin again a new lease of life. Like the people who drive them, the Super 7 is definitely not just a number. A car which makes men out of boys and little boys out of grown men.